detail.
No, like the last guy was fine. First guy?
I know, David Hume. Vernon Street is actually great. I actually attended his seminar in Davis, California, or the Orange County. Where is the, God, what is that university? I forgot.
Chapman. George Mason or Chapman?
No, he was Chapman University, right? Experimental economics, where what he talks about when you sit down at the computer and you do the game, we actually played that game and a number of things and observed students playing the game, so it's really good. Really good. Yeah. Okay, so,
Oh, snap.
yeah. Okay. Get started? So I guess what I'm going to do is first actually get the material. But it's not, we haven't even started a topic.
How would you be on the topic?
Yeah.
Is it filming?
Alright, so we got Calvin. Wait a minute. Okay, Calvin, Nate, and Robin. So, Calvin, you can get started.
All right. So one thing that I think was really interesting is that you know, some of these readings are somewhat archaic, at least by today's standards, as far as economics go, in the entire in the entire scheme of things. So like this, like in today's society, how should we like define property in economics? Is it more than like just one's possessions, or is it like what people like the goods that people actually create? Or, you know, obviously in some situations you have like different like bonds and stuff that are linked together. So has that like definition of property expanded today? And then like Madison said that his opinions and free communication of them are his property. So how does that relate to property today?
Okay, great question. So first, one topic. Heidi?
Well, I on the John Knox paper is the one that was read in like the vertical portrait form. In the readings, he talks about like this guy who found an acorn and he starts to eat it, and then they call it like his, and then they start questioning like at what point did it become his, and it's on chapter 5 of the John Knox one of property, section 28. But I think what he's trying to get across is that property isn't is something that I guess no one else has taken like ownership of. It's yours. It's like just anyone. Like he talks about the acorn that he picked up under the oak, and like the apples gathered from the trees in the wood. That it's himself. No one else can deny him that that's his. And I think that the idea is that like if it's no one else's, it's yours.
Okay, so great. I mean, when we talk about this, you mentioned that why is this not relevant today? And when we talk about this, let's focus on what is the initial acquisition of property and what situation we're in right now. So right now we got Marie and Jacob and Jennifer.
Great. Sorry, my voice. I don't actually think it is all that archaic, because some of the writing is really annoying, but it's still pretty relevant today. It's like you cited the quote by James Madison, and I really love that about the idea that your ideas and your free expression of them is property. But like Smith defined it as, property right as a guarantee allowing actions to occur within the opportunities and constraints defined by the right. And it's basically the claim to the product of one's own labor and to the further productive yield generated by the savings from that product. So I think that's still very present today in also like capitalistic societies that function on capitalism, is because if you've made something, then it's yours. If you were the one that collected all of it, put it all together, that's yours. So I think that the basic idea of property rights is still the same. I think that can change with communism and socialism. That kind of shifts the idea of property rights. But the basic idea, I would say, is still the same as it ever was.
Okay, great. So I've got a bunch of people on topic. So for the sake of, so that we can actually have a number of topics, if you're on topic, your comments should be kind of brief. Maybe like 3-4 sentences or something. Otherwise we have a lot of people. And then if you're off topic, then we can actually expound a little bit more. You can actually ask questions a little more instead of time. So I've got Jacob, Jeffrey.
Okay. So the question you asked about how property rights have shifted in the modern world, I think that's an interesting question. I think there's two kind of things that have made major influences on that. I think the first thing is just the kind of rise of the value of intellectual property, which obviously there's been intellectual property for a long time, but I think that now the most valuable things in our society are ideas, the things that can profit the most, or it's more than just tangible goods, it's the actual ideas that people have. And the second thing is the idea, especially with intellectual property, also non-tangible property like things on the internet or electronic things like that, the idea that someone can own something and then make a copy of it, I think that shifts a lot of the way you think about property. And I think that we're just kind of in the beginning stages of our shifting understanding of that.
I also want to talk about Madison's thought of property as your opinions and freedom of expression. And that just to me, the first thing that clicked was that that's what our First Amendment Constitution was founded upon, was that freedom of speech and religion. And so I just never thought of property as being your own expressions or opinions. And so I thought it was cool how it connected back to how government was instituted to protect your property. And so that the First Amendment is kind of about what Madison is saying with how your expression of opinion and religion is also your property as well.
Okay, great. Before we go to others, and Kira is next, I want you to think about this a little more and think about property rights. We tend to think about property rights as like land or other kinds of things that we produce, but what's the distinction between property rights and human rights? So think about that as we go into the next. Okay, Kira.
Yeah, speaking of that, I think it's when we're talking about the changes that have occurred between when these were written and how we think about property rights today, it's interesting to think about who they thought that property rights applied to. Because I know Madison, I think this is part of the Federalist Papers, he talks about a man's land, and he only talks in terms of, the male owning something, especially property, because when, back in the day, land was passed on through the male heir. And so I'm wondering, what has changed in that who do we think property is assigned to today, and who do they think it was assigned to then? And I do think that's an issue of human rights. Yeah, more than just like a shift in what we see morality as, I guess.
Okay, great. And Dean?
I was gonna say I kind of agree with Marie that the basic property rights haven't really changed, and I don't really view these readings as archaic, even like the older ones. Like Locke and Hume talk about, mostly Hume, that the first person to land can put their rightful claim on it, and that's not as important today because there's not much land that's undiscovered or anything. But Locke also kind of talks about how money subsumes all other claims, and Hume talks about one of his sections is the transference of property by consent. So still to this day, if you offer somebody enough money, or not necessarily money, even like a good, and they agree to give part of their land to you, then those still basic rules of property that Hume and Locke outlined are still apply.
Okay,
I just wanted to comment on how I think I agree with I agree with most people when they're saying that the basic ideas of property haven't changed, but I also really agree with Jacob when he's talking about like how right now we have a lot of intellectual property and like stuff is going online and tangible things are like, well, we still value tangible things and they're still property, but there's also like intangible things such as like the website Facebook or something like that where it's worth billions of dollars, but it's not actually like, you can't actually like touch it or anything like that. You can only just interact with it online, and I feel like that's just like the shift in property changes. When they were originally like writing this, Locke and Madison, they never really considered like stuff that's untangible being worth a lot of money a day.
Great point when we talk about is that there's no more land to conquer. Well, what about cyberspace? What about intellectual property? Came up with the idea first, so just Daniel.
All right, so yeah, kind of going off of that, about how there isn't really any land left to conquer. Locke keeps talking about how, you know, if you take this land, it's not really detracting from everybody else because there's enough land to go around and that's okay. So you're not really taking anything from anyone else. But now, because there's so many people, because the world is like really shrunk from the vast like openness that it has into what we know where everything is and everything, it seems like now the only limit to what you can do, the only limit to your production is the land that you have, right? So that means like cutting down rainforests and things in order to expand your land, which is going into other people. So this, like, I mean, obviously when Locke was writing, I mean, this was before the Western expansion of America, so there was all that open land that hadn't been touched yet, and that was only, you know, Indians only lived on it, so that was kind of, there was this really big open world that anybody could go into and farm their own thing and do whatever they wanted, but now it seems because the world's a lot smaller, you can't really do that anymore, and this seems kind of archaic and antiquated.
Okay, great. Kelsey, what do you guys?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, you already see Locke touching upon the fact that property is not what it used to be in the state of nature, as he refers to it. Because, I mean, you have him commenting that humans have kind of changed the way that that works because they've created cities and they've given property designations and decided like, oh, this land is going to be mine. And I mean, he comments like kind of the difference between England and America. But his comment is also that England at the moment, the way that works is more beneficial to us because the labor and what we're able to produce with the land that everyone is working on and everyone owns is more than just what we naturally produce. So, and that kind of relates back to Hume's commentary, like everything that we do, we kind of create this structure for our own benefit. And that's kind of all of economics, is just things that humans have created to benefit us.
Edwin and then Nate.
Well, I agree with Daniel in what he says that John Locke basically says that every man should have as much as he can make use of. But now that we're limited in our resources, and now that like land and stuff, this doesn't really apply to us now, especially. And I mean, John Locke kind of foreshadows this in saying, "And thus came in the use of money, some lasting thing that men might keep without spoiling." So before he was saying that we should have as much as we should have until it spoils, or like to the point where we don't have surplus. But now that we have money, we have something that's like not very, it's not going to spoil, and so you have more hoarding, and then there's like a lot more different like property rights now that one can make use of land in whatever way he wants, that he claims that he has money.
Nate for on topic, and then we've got about 4 more people, and then we go on topic. Okay, Nate. Yeah.
Well, kind of going on Edward's point, I think that Locke, he kind of makes his rules around tangible products, and that you can take as much as you can as long as you have enough for everyone else. But in the internet, when there's no like quantifiable volume of stuff, I don't think it applies, because you can take as much as you want, but there's always more. And so it's like there's no limit of satiability and limit of amount of stuff you can get.
Gabe.
I was interested, especially like with Locke and Madison's point of view, where people have I mean, Locke stated in some of his things about government that people give up their own security their own freedom for their own security to protect their property. And I think it's very interesting, like when Madison first wrote the Constitution, he made income taxes illegal. And so people got to keep their own property, where like, I think for a lot, there was another changing thing about, I think 100 years ago, income taxes became legal. Now people pay a percentage of the property that they earn to the government to help protect the rest of their property. And I think it's a very interesting, when you talk about the way that it's changing, is that now that there's no more property left to be conquered or open space to be just to stick a flag into, the people are more concerned about protecting what they have and giving up some of what they have to protect the rest of it.
Okay, very good. Mark, Cheng, Gina, and Chris, and then we exhausted stuff.
So, Locke's discussion of physical property actually reminds me, seems more fitting to me about ideas or things that are still effectively unlimited today. We aren't really on track to run out of, say, websites anymore. So as long as you can pay the fee to maintain your hold over it, then effectively it's yours as long as you keep maintaining it. And so that actually reminds me a lot of the physical property in Locke's time, even though now physical property has become more scarce. Also, I think it's interesting to note that Madison wrote eminent domain into the Constitution, and Jefferson actually was really against that, and one of the Loyal rights, which means you couldn't ever take land away. And so I feel like Madison almost compromised on his own principles as he laid out in his statement there. But
And Cheng-Sok?
Well, I just kind of wanted to go off back to what we were talking about intellectual property, and I kind of agreed with Calvin in that this article kind of is archaic because there's some intellectual property nowadays that just kind of I think go a little bit too far, because I know that Apple is suing Samsung because they have certain movements that are the same, and they said that they have patented those movements of how they view pictures on their products. And so how far is it going to go as intellectual property? They're pretty much saying that I can't move my fingers the same way that Apple requires them to move it. How far is this intellectual property going to go? Is someone going to patent the way you walk so that I can't walk that way unless I was given permission? So I think that this article didn't really talk about that kind of stuff, and so I just thought it was interesting that how far are we willing to take it as to our property.
Okay, great. I want you to think also as we go to other topics. We still have about 2 more people in other topics. What do Locke, Hume, Smith, and Madison think about perpetuity of ownership of property, especially intellectual property? If you write something, you have a right to that. At what point does that become basically open to the whole society? What do they think, right? What do they support? So, Gina, Chris, and Rabin.
Alright, so to basically just go back to what Mark and Nate, I think, were saying about how, I guess, intellectual property on the internet is sort of the new land, in that, it's a lot more open, sort of how, the country was before and the physical property. But the thing is that I feel like there's a big difference between who can profit from that, because before, when it comes to farming, he's talking about picking acorns and apples off the ground. Other than a small percentage of people with physical disabilities, most people can just do that, regardless of their educational level or how rich they are. Whereas now, if you want to make money off of the internet, creating websites, making companies like Apple and Samsung, that's not something that everyone can do and everyone can earn their living off of. So I think it's just interesting that that's the modern equivalent, but there's definitely still a discrepancy between who can benefit from that might need to be addressed.
Chris?
I think you just brought up an interesting point there about barriers to entry. This property system, but I think another one that someone mentioned the word Indians earlier, and something I noticed that was interesting is that Locke talks in section 26, kind of alludes to Indians, but it's obvious that he and the other people writing this time, especially him, because he actually discusses that a little bit, didn't consider the Indians to have the same right as other people's property. And I think this is part of that civil rights, property rights tie that kind of developed a bit further in the intervening time between Locke and the later people, especially today. So I'm just wondering that, like, considering what Gina said, would we consider everyone to have equal rights to property today?
Rabin?
Okay, yeah, I agree with what Gina said also, because people were talking about how they consider like land and like tangible goods and non-tangible goods like land and like websites to be the same, but I feel like there's a lot more debate now just because you don't know necessarily, you know, who thought of the idea. Or, like someone brought up Facebook earlier, like there's a lot of debate about who thought of that idea first. And like, I feel like the articles are a little bit archaic because, I mean, obviously they couldn't like know what was gonna, you know, happen in the future, and so the transfer of property is less clear now. That like we have intangible goods.
Okay, very good. All right, so the new topic, we have got Nate, Robin, Aiden, and Marie. So we're spending a lot of time on one topic, but I think as we go along, we'll see that there's going to be more and more less a little bit on-topic course, which is fine because I'm going to have to restrict that so that everybody has a chance to introduce new topics. Okay, so Nate.
Okay, I just wanted to bring up the study question about reading Hume and walking tandem. And I think that really what should be brought out of the two readings is that they use satiability in two completely different ways, because Hume uses the premise that humans are insatiable as a necessity to create property, but Locke uses the satiability of humans as a rationing function to bring to quantify like a human's ability to gain property. And so I think out of that they shouldn't be read as coincident theories.
Yes. Here.
I mean, this is kind of on that note. I guess what was interesting to me was when Hume was talking about, like, theoretically, how humans aren't completely generous, you know, by nature, and they're also not completely selfish by nature, and there needs to be a balance between the two. And Locke didn't really mention that at all, but Hume was talking about, you know, theoretically, I guess this was before communist theory, but if humans were completely generous and we were all just a family that shared everything, I mean, that's completely unrealistic, and it would also be a completely different matter of society's function than is today. It's that, like, there has to be a balance between self-need and caring for others, and sometimes the two coincide. But yeah, Locke didn't really mention that at all.
Miles.
Yeah, I think this is really evident in the writings of James Madison when he says, "Where an excess of power prevails, property of most are duly respected, and no man is safe in his opinions, his person, his faculties, or his possessions." But then he says, "Where there is an excess of liberty, the effect is the same, though from an opposite cause." And I think that Smith also touches on this, because Smith, I feel, is kind of trying to advance this theory of sort of compassionate capitalism. Like, we should be looking out for our own interests, and we should be trying to accrue property, but that, like, something that goes along with that is that we should be, like, compassionate, and that we should look out for others, and that we have this natural sense and obligation to.
Okay, now when we're talking about Smith, also let's talk about two different types of interactions. Right? We're talking about that. Interactions with your own kind of a friends, a family, kind of small groups, versus kind of impersonal interactions. So where does that compassion play there? Where does the idea of capitalism, this kind of idea of that you're sharing and distributing resources in this kind of, kind of impersonal exchange, I mean. Gabe.
I'm also we know the changing human. I mean, starting I guess when people started examining humanity in the 1600s with Thomas Hobbes, they started with a very evil. They say humanity exists in a very evil state of nature, and like Hobbes was for a complete absolute monarchy to control, or Hobbes or Machiavelli at the time, to control humanity's state of nature, and so it can protect itself from itself. Where then you go all the way down to, I guess this is off the two perspectives I was talking about too. People like Karl Marx in the 19th century who believe that in communism and people living together. And I think it really also has to do with the way that people's values merge. I know Hume talked about this, about like the value of justice, and like the way it kind of, it's not necessarily natural in people, and it emerges to through people's own experience, and that they kind of, to benefit themselves, when people realize they have to work with the people around them, and that you can't just kill somebody because you know what they have, and that you have a certain, you have to, but at the same time you want to keep what you earn, and you can't give away everything you have either. So it's a balance between self-interest and justice.
Okay. Aiden.
When I was reading Hume talking about how shared property, my first thought was about people like trusting their fellow man to take care of the land, and if they could do that. And then I thought it was really interesting how Smith, when he talked about like the reciprocity of like trust or generosity, like the scenario with people passing the money over to let their fellow like partner take control of their fate, I guess. So you could say from Smith's perspective that if you took care of your land, then you could expect somebody else to return the favor and manage it. But I also, to talk about Gabe's like discussion on Hobbes and evil of humanity, I don't think people have that inborn trust of each other, and it wouldn't function to like have them communally share land or something.
That's a great point. We're getting to the fundamental questions of why these rights exist, right? First, we have to really, in economics, we have to understand how things work. And then afterwards, we understand the processes through which how things work. So we're understanding what is the interaction of human beings. So at the fundamental level, all of the writers here are trying to understand what is the fundamental nature of a human being. Is it trusting? Selfishness, and really understanding that. From there, then we come to the understanding of property and how we share and interact, and then we kind of acquire property initially and how we transfer property initially. So you have to have a fundamental basis for this stuff. So that's a great point that we're going to go into. Okay, Robin.
Okay. Well, I was actually going to touch on that. In Hume's article, he actually says that every single act is performed in expectation that others will perform the like, and he says that on page 320 of his article. But anyways, I guess I was going to ask if you guys agreed with that, but also kind of touching on that whole, why do we do things? Is it for a selfish nature, like he claims it is? I guess I would say that I do agree with him in a lot of ways. Like in the old days, if you helped someone build their barn after a rainstorm or something, you kind of expected that if your barn ever fell down, you know, the community would also help you. And if you didn't help anybody build back their barn, then when your barn was in trouble or something, nobody would help you. You would, you know, lose all your profit and whatnot. So I think in a large way that it's true that you never really just give up your time. You always kind of do it to either strengthen a relationship, or you do it to either feel good or strengthen a relationship, or actually gain something out of it, like pay or something.
And keeping that in mind, in today's global world, where I can leave the society and go to a different society very easily, is the reciprocity still happening? Daniel and Daniel, right?
So, well, one thing, especially comparing Locke to some of the other readings that we've looked at, and just other people like Hobbes, you know, that Gabe brought up, is that Locke definitely seems to me like a lot more naive than everybody else, because he seems to, you know, as we mentioned before, that everybody's just going to take what they need and nothing more, and the whole idea of this, obviously, his main thing is the social contract, that everybody just comes together, and because the alternative would be a lot worse, and that everybody's going to work together, and not fight seems to kind of ignore the fact that war and theft are far more common than peace and love, and you know, in all of history. And one thing he definitely doesn't address is when he's talking about property, is that when property changes hands by like force of violence, because he says that property is kind of handed down by God, and then everybody just makes what they will. But what happens when, you know, somebody kills somebody and takes their property, or when somebody gets conquered? Should the property, you know, all go to like the 2 survivors that fled that burning city, or should it stay with the conquerors and then be handed down from generation to generation? And he doesn't really address that at all, or even seem to acknowledge that people steal from each other and oftentimes violate this social contract and, you know, take what they want from people instead of letting the people keep it themselves.
Okay, great. We've got a bunch of people on topic in here, so Gino, your last one. And then from there, we're going to move on to the next topic. So right now, Dan, okay, Aiden. Yeah.
I remember you were talking about the compassion, and then we were talking about the compassion towards another, why we do things. And then I remember in the reading on obligation of promises, he talks about one of the first obligations of performance of promises is something about common benefit, or like a common interest for everyone. And I think he's got a point, because like for day-to-day action, it's not like we all make profit out of everything we do. There are sometimes when it's some we lose some, we gain some. I think as long as, like he said, as long as there's a common interest and there's a common goal, people will try to work towards that goal and to better themselves inside. You know, they're thinking, you know, for me, but also for the community, so that they can also better themselves. And then it makes you think, like, what does it take for there to be criminals? Does it just take one person to be anti-interest to the whole society, or does there or can people counter that? Like, at what point do like criminals start coming up? Like, do they like not regard the interest of society, or like do they not regard the same interest as everyone else?
Are they violating the trust, or violating the convention that he was talking about? That they're opting out of the convention. If they're opting out of the convention, what is already? Kelvin.
Okay. So one thing that was sort of interesting is this, like, sacrifice of property, or like or like the helpfulness that people have been talking about. It's interesting to see it like in the economics from like a free market capitalist society versus socialism, and everyone's really always been sort of against this idea of socialism and socialism in the economy, and that many of the socialist nations that have been around have failed, but we even here in the U.S. we make these sacrifices. Like the government bailed out all of the automotive things, which all the automotive companies, which in a real free market society, I don't know if that would happen, and you would see this this exchange of helpfulness between people. So that makes me wonder if there is a little more compassion in capitalism than just a complete straight competition.
Kira.
Going back to talking about the fundamental nature of humans, I think it's interesting to think about when we were roaming the plains of Africa. It's more advantageous to us, to an individual survival, to band together with other humans, and it's why today we kind of have we kind of naturally antagonize people who are different from us, because if it was another tribe threatening our land or threatening our resources, we automatically, it's more advantageous to us to make them the enemy. And so that, I think it's interesting, because Hume does talk about how the objective of laws about property is for the good of society. And so selfish interests, and this also kind of ties back to the invisible hand theory, that the interests of companies kind of ties into the interests of society. So bettering yourself and helping out other people is serving your own self-interest, but it helps other people to help yourself. And I think that makes Hume's article and a lot of the articles really relevant today because we still have that like fundamental human nature to help ourselves.
Okay, great. We're going to go Gabe, but I want to make a really quick comment because let's link things to things that we have talked about in current events and what Kelvin was talking about, bailing out automotive industry, right? When we're looking at it from the Locke standpoint, Locke says that if you don't use resources, your property correctly, if you waste it, then you lose the right to that. So automotive industry has property in its own way where they're producing something. And if they're not, if they're wasting it, is it obligation of the society to bail them out? So keep that in mind. Gabe.
I'm glad you said what you did here, because it kind of leads well into me. It's hard in this type of conversation. But I was interested about like the different circumstances in which people work together or antagonize each other. And I think a good example of this is if you look at in the second half of the 19th century in Russia, where the peasants had been enslaved for a long time, and while they were enslaved, they all had a common enemy in the government and the nobles that oppressed them. But then I think it was the 1860s, they were freed from their enslavement, and they were now individual farmers trying to make their own living, and they immediately became like bitter and towards each other, where like they didn't, where once like a success for one peasant was a success for every peasant against the government. Now that they were free, each success was at someone else's expense when they were trying to make their own thing, and the peasants were not supportive of each other's goals. And so it kind of, as self-interest changes, people band together and can separate from each other very easily.
Okay, Marie.
Is this supposed to be my on-topic thing or my is?
Well, that's okay. You can, because we're going to go to you right after this. Well, we're doing the argument and then we're to you. So you want to
Okay, well,
on topic?
I'm just kind of going to do the question because that's
Okay.
kind of what it's about anyway.
Okay, great.
But it has a little bit to do with what Karen and Gabe just were talking about. Is kind of like, or what Gabe was talking about is how, like, you know, the political situation is changing, how that changes interactions between people. So I wanted to relate that to the relationship between justice, property, and scarcity. They talk about how this, you know, scarcity, the selfishness of men, is animated by the few possessions we have in proportion to our wants, and just to restrain the selfishness that men have been obliged to separate themselves from the community and to distinguish between their own goods and those of others. And that has kind of created our idea of like convention, and then justice takes its rise from human convention. So how over like people, we've talked a lot about how what was scarce has changed. So how has the change in scarcity, because, you know, land was plentiful, now it's not so much, now kind of the new land is in ideas and internet and business and things like that. So how has the changing economic scene and scarcity changed the conception of justice over time?
I got Ariel, Nate. No. Yeah. Oh, you.
Eric.
No, Ariel.
Yeah.
No, I think on topic, we're just gonna kind of go to the next topic after this is
Well, my comment was related to the topic kind
Okay.
of, but I mean, I was saying that the reason, kind of on the topic of reciprocity and fundamental nature of humans, I think that idea or suggestion really attends to humans' fundamental nature, and which is that they're selfish, and I think that the reason why humans have a tendency to help others is just because it's an investment in their future, and so it's like if you sacrifice in the short run, you can expect to benefit a profit in the long run.
Okay. Nate, Gina, and then I'm gonna go to Colin. So, and that will be pretty much the last.
Okay.
I know Jacob and others, you guys wanted to make copy, mention, but I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to talk. So, Nate.
I was going to say basically the same thing, but it can be explained in the instance of Smith's like game theory, where your individual, like rationally, your self-interest is to pick the $20 equilibrium as player one. but the idea of reciprocity is like doing to others as you would do unto yourself. And so selfishly, you're expecting the other person to feel obligated to pick the 25-25 equilibrium, and so you pass it on. And so in this sense, being like selfish by yourself is like is obligating others to create like a better wealth, and I guess that's kind of the fundamental idea behind the capitalistic society. That like working for yourself makes the society good as a whole, because makes others feel obligated to do better.
Really, exactly, because when you think about it, what does Hume talk about right at the beginning of the nature of human being, as far as like disadvantages compared to the beasts? We are very weak. What makes us strong? Society. Really, at the end, cooperation will make us strong. Gina, and then Calvin.
I definitely agree with what was just said about, how basically by being selfish, if each of us is selfish, then society betters in general. But just to go back to sort of an old point about, how does, criminalism, I guess, arise, and how do we get criminals in society? If it's like, just some people, are, more selfish than others. But I feel like something that we didn't address was, the possibility, basically, if I do something and if I do something for someone else and I expect them to do the same for me, that expectation comes not just from, society's general idea that that's how it works, but also from my past, So if like someone else did something for me and then later I did something for them, I would repeat the process because I have, more trust in that system. Whereas I can't speak for, the criminal society or anything. But in terms of, instead of just being, like, oh, some people are just, not they don't think the same way, or they're just on sort of a different moral scale, I would say it could just be that, the system for them didn't really work out, and they had gotten screwed over in the past, or they felt that they had, yeah.
Calvin?
I guess going back to what Calvin said about the auto industry, thinking back to why we actually bailed out the big companies, I think the main motivation for that was the idea that we needed these companies to exist in society rather than having not exist. So by bailing them out, we preserve kind of our own individual benefit, right? And so I guess I completely agree with Nate in saying that the idea behind all of this is mainly selfish. I believe that humans are naturally selfish. I mean, we may say that, oh, as we assimilate into society, then our own personal, our own personal beliefs and benefits come from just working together as a society. So by being selfish, we kind of make our own ideals status.
Great. Now, actually, before we go to the next topic, I'm faced with kind of a choice, a problem that is related to this meetings, right? Property right here is defined by the time that you guys get to talk, right? And the scarcity is that we don't have enough time. I've noticed that each new topic that has been introduced takes about 15 minutes or so to get through. So I've got Aiden, Kelsey, and Lucia. But Lucia hasn't had a chance to talk, so should we give her the chance to talk first or others?
No, I don't.
That's a good question right here. Yeah.
Justice. Like, I don't think she should be because. I mean, not because she's like not my friend or anything. Because she's had all this time to raise her hand if she wanted to, and obviously Aiden's talked 2 or 3 times. That's because he did raise his hand and took the initiative. And I'm not saying she should be like being lazy or anything, but I'm just saying like she shouldn't be like. That's like saying like.
It's like General Motors. Lucia is General Motors.
Yeah, we can't.
I mean, I think this gets back to the first harpoon rule that Smith introduces that goes back to Inuit time with the hunters, where it rewards the greater risk and cost of being the first to harpoon.
Okay.
This incredibly dangerous prey being the discussion.
Exactly. So I guess as a society in here we have decided that you're going to have to wait your turn.
So I mean, I guess
unless you want to make comments on topic, when others have introduced. So right now we go to Hayden. Sorry, Hayden.
This is kind of based off one of the focus questions, but with Hume discussing how rich people are good for the economy because by being rich they haven't spent all their money and they leave so much of their total accumulation for society as a whole. It goes back to like, I think what Edwin and Gabe, I think in the first question talked about hoarding, and Locke also talks about if you're not going to use your resources, then that's not a good rule of economics. So I was just basically asking how the rich people not spend, like by keeping their accumulation, how is that good for the economy as a whole? Instead of putting it back into.
Okay, Robin, Calvin. Okay, good.
Yeah, well, Smith says that we should all love rich people because they consume such a small percentage of their accumulation, leaving almost all of it to work in the economy, and makes the rest of us better off. So Smith also introduces that idea, and I guess I was with Aiden in that I didn't really understand why them not spending the money and then holding their property and their money and not sending it back to the into the economy, how that benefited the less well-off people. And also, like, this kind of reminded me of the Occupy movement. Like, this is why all these uprisings and angry people are coming up, because the rich are holding so much of the wealth and the poor aren't holding very much. So I don't know if it's just that like times have changed, or if what Smith and Hume are saying is just completely wrong, or I don't know either. But also, how does this relate to the Occupy?
Okay.
This is my question.
Very good.
I guess one thing we can kind of tie back to what we were talking about earlier, the idea of intellectual property. So I know this isn't a general case, but for some cases, I guess, notable tech giants such as Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, they have certain intellectual property that gets eventually passed down to the, I guess, end user. So in many ways, the intellectual property is kind of how it's being distributed into the economy. But then I again also see the aspect of if they don't spend any money, then how are they, or I mean, if they don't spend a large percentage of their wealth, then how are they actually going to help the economy? I guess one thing I just thought of is, I don't know if this is just me, but whenever I see a really rich person, I think, oh, I want to be like that rich person, so then it motivates me as an individual to work harder.
Well, we're talking about spending, right? What do rich people do if they don't spend? Where does the money go?
Real estate.
Okay. Okay.
Well, it's just also, I think it's also to do with changing economic theory. At the end of the 17th century, the French economist, Colbert, he was a big proponent of mercantilism, which kind of believed in a limited amount of wealth. And it means that whatever you have, I can't have. And so that rich people were not necessarily a good thing for the individual person, because there it goes to Occupy Wall Street, where you see people with all the money and saying they have all the money that I have. But then you move on to people like Adam Smith, who got away from mercantilism, and you move towards a more of a free market capitalist system, where now you get to a system where wealth is created, and people are able to create wealth through capital investments and through their own intellectual inventions. That there's much less of a distrust and dislike of rich people, because, as Calvin says, you have an ability to become like a rich person. You don't have to steal their wealth to become rich. You can create your own wealth through your own capital and gains.
Okay, Jeffrey.
I was actually going to bring up what we talked about, was that the way that they do help out the economy is that what they don't spend, it's either in the banks where where more money is being created from that, where they're investing in the stock market. So overall, it's just boosting the economy. But I wanted to kind of tie back to kind of the Locke theory of how he talks about how you should only take as much as you need. And so I thought it's kind of interesting how it can be thought of that rich people who be thought of as taking more than what they need can be beneficial. And so it's kind of contradicting what Locke thought of, was that rich people can in fact help our society and our economy as opposed to what was previously thought.
Excellent. Gina?
Well, I was going to sort of make a similar point basically about how the rich invest their money, but when people talk about movements like Occupy Wall Street, which is like a backlash against that just accumulation of money by a small amount of individuals, you know, we're talking about how it benefits society and like the overall, you know, national or even international economy. But if, you know, individuals aren't seeing that on a personal level, then, I mean, I don't know if there's actually just a distance between what they can tell of like how they're benefiting, like they might be benefiting from the overall economy, that in, you know, from how the rich are stimulating the economy as a whole, or that they might just see it how as, they might just consider how their like personal, you know, interests are being screwed over as opposed to, you know, the whole society's interest. So I'm not sure if people are just not seeing that they're actually benefiting from it, or if they're really not, because at this point in time, when we have, you know, banks and the government and lending out money and things, we might not need rich people as much.
But I mean, we're talking about, and that goes back, I know what you're talking about, should we view them as a zero-sum game, the rich have more money, that we have less, or is it because the rich have more money, because they have created a value that we want, and that we made out of society? And that goes back to our readings, I'm not sure if we did it in the class, or macro class, and Bastiat's readings, what is seen, what is not seen, right? What is seen is that we see the rich are rich. Quite often what we don't concentrate is why are we rich? Now obviously there's some rich who acquire the property, you know, not through the fact that they've generated wealth or generated new products or new ideas, like on inheritance, right? So we have to distinguish between that. Yeah, good point. Chris, then Mark, and then Lucy. Yes.
The direct reason, or this is the thing about the Occupy movement, is it doesn't really have one person or even one group articulating the direct message of it. But the message I like to take out of it is the lack of what Calvin was talking about, which is upward social or upward economic mobility. And that is really the thing that drives the free market system, especially the American system. Presidential candidates like to talk about all the time, because it's the idea that this whole thing will work, and if I work hard, I'll get something out of it, which is the reason why we work in the first place. And the reason why the protests happen is because people work and work and work, and at least in their mind they're not getting anything out of it, and they see other people who are getting more out of it, even though they might have worked just as hard or harder. And they're kind of, and sometimes blindly saying, oh, those people did better, so there must be something wrong with the system that made it that way. And to some extent, it just goes down to morality. Like, if the rich are going to be generous, should we have the government make them be generous by taking more of their money? Which is another debate that can be had about the rights to property and
redistribution of wealth.
Yeah. And some people say the lower taxes are on the rich, the better the economy is. I think the way that's supposed to work is the lower taxes are on like business executives, the more they'll create jobs or something like that. But there's also a debate as to whether it actually works that way.
Okay, very good. Mark?
So I think it's informative to look to, well, the majority of wealthy people who have attained their own wealth, not through, say, inheritance, have done so by building on the common things that society has provided, infrastructure, things of that nature. And those investments if society did not make them would likely not be attractive for any individual investor, because it would be pretty hard to pay off the road that you just paid to build on your own, sort of thing. And so most investors would not individually choose to invest in building an interstate highway system. Yet that system has in turn enabled the creation of a lot of wealth. And so I think that sort of creates a bond between the greater society and the people who benefit most from the creation of that system, the wealthiest, where they expect something in return basically for the investment that has collectively been put into such common infrastructure. And so that leads them to expect the wealthy to give more back to the society, not just in the way they would like to invest it, but in the way society would like to invest it.
Okay. Me?
Well, I think first of all, Smith's comment applies mostly to people who earn their own incomes. But the quip I have with that is that basically his idea is that rich people, they spend, they save, and they invest. But people who don't make a lot of money do the exact same thing. And so my question is, does all money stimulate economic growth? Because poor people, they'll spend a greater percentage of their income. But is that equatable to saving that income? Or does that inject as much money into the economy as spending?
That's great. I mean, when we go into the other sections of macroeconomic concepts, what's the impact of consumption on larger economy? And what's the impact of savings on the economy? Which one will make the economy grow? And which one will make it grow in a make it grow in a different kind of way, right? So we'll focus on that and we'll see it.
I would just like to say that when Smith said that we should love rich people, they consume such small portions of accumulation, leave the rest to us. It reminded me of Reagan's, like under his presidency, his supply side economics, the trickle down economics, where he felt that the rich people's economy would help boost the rest of the economy to help the middle and lower classes. And I do agree that most people don't see the effect of rich people's contribution to society and their economic stimulation. And yeah.
Kira?
Oh, okay. So this is going back to what Jeffrey said a long time ago about rich making more than they should, and I kind of want to like introduce the topic of criminality in that sort of way. So Locke is talking about how what you put your labor into, you have the right to reap whatever that gives to you. And there's not exactly an equal playing field, so people who have inherited a large company are obviously going to be a lot better off than someone who is working, a full-time job in retail. But I do think it's interesting to see people who are rich, who have earned an honest living, and whose money is going back into the economy, and people in big corporations like Enron, who are really rich, and the top executives were pulling in a lot of the money. But it wasn't a true portrayal of how much money their company was actually making. And so even though, I think it's interesting to think about the different types of companies and where honesty plays a role, and where justice plays a role in whether or not the richest benefit society.
Okay, very good. I've got about 4 or 5 people on the topic here, and then we're going to Kelsey's topic, because we got about less than 15 minutes remaining, so I want to make sure that we exhaust all the new topics. Okay, Jacob.
Yeah, I just wanted to second Mark said. I think that's a really good point, that there is obviously this huge investment that society has made that's allowed wealthy people to get what they have out of the society. And I think that in talking about the Occupy thing, one cynical way to look at it, I think, is that there's a bunch of people who wish that they were wealthy. But I guess, and going back to the discussion of justice, I think that there's kind of a question of equality, and it seems like a lot of what the Occupy people want is equality of wealth, that the actual wealth should be distributed equally. But I think kind of a better way to look at it in kind of a broader sense is that the problem is kind of a slanted playing field it's just biased towards people who already have money, already have certain advantages, and I think that that's kind of the root of what we're talking about. And I think that does get back to the idea of justice and economics, and whether or not because society, or the people who make our laws can't be completely free from the influence of money. Obviously, to certain different degrees. I think it's an interesting question to decide how much of an influence the money should play in politics, whether or not it's a good thing that wealthy people can have their interests expressed more forcefully than poor people, and how that affects society, and then how that in turn back affects the economy.
Okay, great. Robin.
I said what I need to say on this topic.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Going off of kind of what Jacob said, and I just kind of want to go back to what Chris said about working hard and that you should be getting something out of it, is that I don't think there's any way to gauge how hard these people have worked. Obviously, it does take work to get work to get to the top 1% of society. And so I think that it's kind of unfair to judge them in this kind of negative sense. I know that they make more than any man can handle, but I also think that, you know, I would love to be rich like that, but you kind of have to look at it in their perspective. Like, if I was in their shoes, I would definitely feel that it was unfair that the government or the people are just trying to take away more from what I've worked for. That's kind of like saying, oh, because you're in the top 10% at LASA, you should be given more homework. That's the kind of way I saw it. And, I mean, I know it's not like a perfect example, but, and I think that, like, even if you inherit that kind of money, it still takes work to keep it and retain it. Like, you can't be a fool and just blow it all away. That's kind of like how if you win the lottery, most people go bankrupt. Like, even if you kind of get lucky and somehow get that money, you still have to be smart and work to keep it and to make it bigger or whatever you want to do with it. And so, yeah.
Okay, great. I've got Gabe, Aiden, and then we'll go to Kelsey's topic, and then Miles, you can go back to, make the, I know you wanted to make comment, but you can make comment after Kelsey's topic is introduced. Okay, Gabe.
I like your analogy, but I mean, I think that the one thing with Occupy Wall Street, what you two are getting at, or all three of you, is that things people are not realizing is that the poor people in our country have more rights today than they've ever had in our history. I mean, across the world, up until 100 years ago in the Western world, people making those incomes couldn't even vote, let alone like protest in the streets or have any chance of social mobility, where you had people who were practically slaves to the land that they owned, and they had absolutely no chance of social mobility. I mean, I believe that the people who have the most wealth are the people who have worked the hardest for it. But and it's definitely true that people are born in different situations, but what I think people fail to take into account is that the opportunity for people today to move upwards socially is hundreds of times greater than it was even 100 years ago. And people have more rights now than they ever had before.
Still good,
yeah. Hey.
Well, I think everyone's been saying it's interesting is like looking at no economic opinion is unbiased. Like people are going by like